In the aftermath of Hurricane Matthew, and with Hurricane Harvey finally leaving Texas, it seemed that the worst was behind us and it could only go up from here. But the tropics had other plans. And as Harvey was at its final hour, another tropical wave moved into the Atlantic Ocean, which would unleash a warpath of destruction that would stretch from the Leeward Islands to Georgia in the United States. This hurricane would become the strongest hurricane on record in the Atlantic Basin and would make 7 landfalls, 5 of which were at Category 5 strength. This hurricane would bring the Leeward Islands and the Greater Antilles to its knees, as it brought 185-mile-per-hour winds wherever it went. This hurricane would be the perfect storm and the most intense in 2017. This hurricane would cause widespread destruction and would be the second hurricane to make landfall as a Category 4 hurricane in the United States in 2017, making it the first time that such an occurrence occurred in recorded history. Welcome to the Hurricane Irma Documentary. Hello, I am Pat from Pat's Path Predictor, and welcome to the Hurricane Irma Documentary. Already, 2017 was a very active year for hurricane season, with Hurricane Harvey just making landfall in Texas and causing catastrophic flooding in the Houston area. But just as it seemed the worst was over, the worst was actually yet to come. In this documentary, we will be going over everything, from the science behind Irma, to where it made landfall, to the damage it caused, to its catastrophic impacts across the area, as well as the records that it set along the way. Hurricane Irma would start off as your everyday tropical wave that would enter the Atlantic Ocean from Africa on August 27, 2017. In the next 2 days, the wave would become more organized and start to develop a concentrated area of low pressure. Then, at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on August 29th or 0 UTC on August 30th, this area of interest would become Tropical Depression 11. 6 hours later, it would strengthen further into Tropical Storm Irma based off of satellite estimates. With low shear and a whole ocean of very warm waters, Irma began to strengthen very quickly. Banding became increasingly evident as Irma organized and strengthened further, becoming a hurricane on August 31st in the eastern Atlantic. However, in 6 hours, Irma went from a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm to a 100-mile-per-hour Category 2 hurricane, and would be strengthened to a Category 3 hurricane or major hurricane status by 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Irma was originally a very small hurricane, with hurricane force winds only going out 15 miles from the center. However, major changes were coming that would make Irma into a monster. Irma underwent several Eyewall replacement cycles in the eastern and central Atlantic spanning several days. Each cycle was not weakening the storm, but only making it larger. By September 3rd, a Hurricane Hunter aircraft was sent to investigate Irma, and it discovered that in that time frame, Irma had more than tripled its eye diameter and maintained its intensity the whole time. Even after going through 4 Eyewall replacement cycles, one after another in quick succession, Irma began to turn to the southwest instead of due west, and was now on a collision course with the Lesser Antilles, with Antigua, Barbuda, Anguilla, Montserrat, St. Kitts and Nevis, and other islands in the chain issuing hurricane watches on September 3rd. Hurricane Irma was done with the Eyewall replacement cycles and was now a much larger hurricane. As Irma approached the island chain, it began to strengthen again, becoming a Category 4 hurricane on September 4th at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and hurricane warnings were issued as it approached. However, this was only the start of a major catastrophic event, as Irma began to rapidly intensify, and everyone from the Leeward Islands to Florida was now in its path. Irma would intensify from a 130-mile-per-hour Category 4 hurricane into a 150-mile-per-hour hurricane in 12 hours. But the hurricane hunters went in and found a jaw-dropping discovery as Irma began to impact the Leeward Islands. They found surface winds through dropsons of 175 miles per hour, making it a monster and catastrophic Category 5 hurricane as it was closing in on Barbuda. Days earlier, Antigua evacuated the population on Barbuda as it was expecting a direct hit, but with Irma now a Category 5 hurricane, it would be hell on earth for those who stayed. Irma would strengthen further, eventually strengthening into a 185-mile-per-hour beast with a pressure of 914 millibars. Irma then made landfall at peak strength on Barbuda on September 6th at 2 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, becoming the first of 7 landfalls to occur in the Atlantic Basin. The impact of Irma was catastrophic, with storm surge of up to 15 feet pounding the island. Barbuda would report a pressure of 916.1 millibars, and the lowest ever recorded on the island, even to this day, with a max wind of 118 miles per hour and a max gust of 160 miles per hour before being knocked offline. 6 hours later, Irma made landfall on Saint Martin with equally as much strength and destruction. Anguilla got hit with the northern Eyewall, reporting a max wind of 120 miles per hour before being knocked offline. Irma then approached the Virgin Islands, and by this point, everywhere from the Lesser Antilles to Florida immediately declared states of emergency to prepare for this monster, with Governor Rick Scott of Florida issuing it on September 4th, even before hurricane watches went up, and prepared the people of Florida for Irma, as it was a Category 5 hurricane, and Florida was now in the cone. The big question at this point was, when will Irma turn? Would it turn to the east of Florida, or in the west into the Gulf of Mexico? Miami was in the path of Irma if it turned to the east, and Tampa if it turned to the west. As no one knew when exactly it would start turning, Governor Scott ordered the evacuation of much of South Florida on September 7th, with 6.5 million people ordered to evacuate due to Irma. All 7,000 National Guard troops were deployed by September 8th, and Florida began to prepare and brace for Irma to arrive in the next few days. Meanwhile, Irma continued its path of destruction, making its third landfall at Virgin Gorda in the British Virgin Islands at peak intensity at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on September 6th, with Buck Island reporting a max sustained wind of 106 miles per hour and a gust of 131 miles per hour. Irma also began to impact Puerto Rico with its outer bands as the hurricane had grown greatly in size, with tropical storm force winds now extending 190 miles from the center, and hurricane force winds extending 60 miles from the center. To put this in perspective, 3 Hurricane Andrews could fit in Irma with area to spare. Soon, the Turks and Caicos and parts of the Bahamas issued hurricane warnings, with Cuba issuing tropical storm warnings for the eastern part of the island. Hurricane watches now extended to central Cuba as they began to prepare for Irma. As Irma moved away from the Virgin Islands, Doppler radar in Puerto Rico began to show an elliptical or more oval eye and double eyewalls, which usually indicates the start of an eyewall replacement cycle, but it is likely that these double eyewalls had been established since Irma approached the Lesser Antilles. Nevertheless, Irma began to move north of Puerto Rico through the night of September 6th and 7th, staying 60 miles offshore, which was enough to bring hurricane force winds to the island and cause significant damage there. Irma then moved parallel to Hispaniola on September 7th, getting pretty close to the Dominican Republic, which once again brought hurricane force winds to the island. However, Irma's second eyewall began to absorb the energy away from the inner eyewall, and the eyewall replacement cycle that was long anticipated began. Irma began to slowly weaken, but its wind field began to expand considerably, with hurricane force winds now extending nearly 80 miles from the center. Irma then passed to the north of Haiti and approached the Turks and Caicos, bringing up to 20 feet of storm surge there as Irma continued to ravage much of the Greater Antilles and the southern Bahamas. However, Irma weakened down to Category 4 hurricane status, with winds of 150 miles per hour by September 8th. This ended a 60-hour period of continuous Category 5 strength, which has not been seen before or since, of which a staggering 36 hours was at peak strength, a record that is still held to this day. However, Irma was now bringing hurricane force winds to Cuba, and with the replacement cycle complete, it began to re-strengthen. Hurricane warnings went up for much of Cuba and Florida as Irma appeared to now move into the Gulf of Mexico and strike the Tampa area when it would eventually make landfall in Florida. Irma then made landfall in Little Anguilla, in the Bahamas on September 8th, which thankfully is uninhabited but still caused much damage to the forests that were on the island. Irma would re-strengthen into a Category 5 hurricane on the same day at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time and took a more due westward turn towards Cuba. Irma would show deep convection similar to that of its peak as northern Cuba was impacted by the southern eyewall of Irma. Then, at 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Irma made landfall at Cayo Romano, Cuba, with winds of 165 miles per hour, becoming only the second Category 5 hurricane on record to hit Cuba, with the first being the 1932 Cuba hurricane. However, the landfall in Cuba did two things to Irma that would change the hurricane going forward. First, the mountainous terrain in central Cuba disrupted the storm's core, and it began to rapidly weaken as it remained over Cuba for several hours. The second thing it did was change its trajectory. It originally was expected to make a close pass to Cuba and enter the Gulf of Mexico and slowly turn towards Tampa in the St. Petersburg area in Florida. But Irma jogged to the west and made landfall in Cuba instead, and that westward jog allowed the storm to turn much earlier than expected, putting Florida Keys in the Naples area in significant danger. After causing catastrophic damage to much of Cuba for 20 hours, Irma turned north towards the Florida Keys, but was now a high-end Category 2 hurricane with winds of 110 miles per hour. However, Irma now entered even warmer waters than before, allowing it to quickly reorganize and re-strengthen back to a Category 4 hurricane as it approached the Florida Keys, causing major damage as the eye approached the island chain. Then, on September 10th at 9:10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Irma made its sixth landfall on Cudjoe Key, with Key West reporting a max wind gust of 110 miles per hour. This Category 4 strength landfall would be the first time on record that two Category 4 hurricanes made landfall in the same season in the United States, with Harvey being the other Category 4 landfall. Irma now moved quicker toward Collier County, Florida, with storm surge of 10 to 15 feet expected for much of the state. However, increasing wind shear finally began to tear the structure apart, and it weakened down to a Category 3 hurricane as it approached land for the final time. On September 10th, 2017, at 3:35 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Irma made its seventh and final landfall at Marco Island, Florida. In Naples, meteorologist Mike Bettis was battling the eyewall of the hurricane while reporting what was going on there. Naples reported a max wind gust of 142 miles per hour in the airport.
This truly is exhausting. Sometimes I feel like I'm in good shape. I'm not so sure anymore. This is an eyewall. This is truly an eyewall here, and now the intensity of it is right upon us. Right here in the heart of Naples, right along US 41 Tamiami Trail. If you go down this road, you head down to the right, you'll get into all the beaches. You'll go down to the mall straight ahead. The trees are doing pretty well. Wish I could say the same for myself. But ultimately, we're going to get out of this. This is only going to last for a few hours. We're going to be out of this, and we're going to have an opportunity to take a breather, right?
As Irma moved inland, it caused major damage to much of Florida, as well as much flooding to the low-lying state. It also began to weaken, becoming a Category 2 hurricane at 6 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time and a Category 1 hurricane on September 11th at 2 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Irma moved inland, crossing into Georgia as Atlanta was issued their first ever tropical storm warning, and Irma became a tropical storm at 8 a.m. Irma would then continue to move and slowly weaken as it moved further inland, with it becoming a tropical depression on 11 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, with the NHC no longer issuing advisories on Irma. Finally, on September 13th, Irma dissipated while over Missouri, bringing heavy rain to the region and leaving behind a path of catastrophe never before seen. To understand the scope of the damage Irma caused, We have to look at each island individually, because Irma's impact was not spread evenly. In Barbuda, the central government based in Antigua lost communication with the island for several hours. The state of the island was unclear, but it was suspected that Irma had completely destroyed the island. But it was much worse than that. When Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Gaston Brown, surveyed the island via helicopter, he found that it was effectively inhabitable, with apocalyptic damage across the island. 95% of Barbuda's structures were damaged or destroyed, a scale similar to that of the Greensburg tornado back in 2007. Many areas were completely flattened by the 185-mile-per-hour winds Irma brought with it, while other areas were completely submerged by its storm surge. It was also feared that the exotic and extremely rare species of wildlife would be completely killed off by the storm. However, this was thankfully not the case. Most of these birds and other wildlife miraculously survived the storm. Nevertheless, the damage was total. In Barbuda, $150 million of damage occurred, with only 3 people killed as a result of the vast majority of the population being evacuated days prior to the storm. In Antigua, being just outside of the Eyewalls, the damage was much less severe and more moderate, but still extensive, with the roofs being torn off, downed power lines all over the place, and uprooted trees all over the roads. No one was killed in Antigua, but there was still $30 million in damage. That, combined with Barbuda, was worth 10% of the country's GDP at the time. In Anguilla, Irma's northern eyewall impacted the island as it was passing over Barbuda, and the damage there was catastrophic, but not as bad as Barbuda. Many homes and schools were destroyed, and the only hospital on the island was severely damaged. On the eastern part of the island, the damage was at its worst, with the uprooted trees blocking 90% of the roads. The island's airport and air traffic control tower were badly damaged, and it only complicated matters as communication on the island was still very limited and poor. Surprisingly, only 1 person was killed, but there was still over $290 million in damages that occurred. On Saint Martin, where Irma made landfall next, the damage was equally as apocalyptic as in Barbuda. Irma completely tore buildings off their foundations, and an island-wide blackout occurred due to Irma's insane winds. Irma destroyed 95% of structures, 60 of which were uninhabitable. On the French side of Saint Martin, many marinas were reduced to rubble as the storm surge engulfed them, and the boats docked there were smashed together, with some of them destroyed to the point of no recovery. A hotel notably caught fire during the hurricane, but because of the hazardous conditions, no one would come to put it out, allowing it to burn to the ground, with another hotel's ground floor almost completely destroyed. In total, 8 people were killed on the island of Saint Martin, 4 each for the French and Dutch sides of the island. The damage was worth $7.15 billion, with the French side getting the more damage due to Irma's core making landfall on that side. The French side suffered $4.17 billion in damages, while the Dutch side suffered nearly $3 billion. In St. Barthélemy, the destruction described by one local was, quote, like a bomb that burned all vegetation, while another stated it was as if the island was wiped off the map. A wind gust of 199 miles per hour was detected by an anemometer before it was knocked offline. Storm surge swept away entire coastal settlements, with one hotel being stripped of all but the foundation, effectively slapping the whole building. The fire station on the island was engulfed in 6 feet of water before it receded. In total, 7 people were killed in St. Barthélemy, and the damage totaled at $480 million. However, unlike the 3 other islands we talked about so far, St. Barthélemy recovered quickly, and by early 2018, it was fully operational once again. The British Virgin Islands suffered catastrophic damage, with some islands like Tortola suffering apocalyptic damage due to it getting directly hit by Irma's eyewall. The vegetation in these islands turned brown due to the hurricane. Cane Garden Bay's residential area was left in ruins according to satellite imagery. Irma passed over Necker Island, causing significant damage and infamously destroying the mansion of Richard Branson on the island. In total, 4 people were killed in the British Virgin Islands, and the damage was totaled at $3.6 billion, making it the worst natural disaster in the island chain's history. The U.S. Virgin Islands were not exempt. St. Thomas and St. John suffered catastrophic damage, with St. Thomas suffering widespread structural damage, including their police station and airport. 3 people were killed on St. Thomas, and many others were injured. On St. John, the island lost power and access to the local airport, as well as cargo and shipping access due to Irma. In total, $1.1 billion in damage occurred, and Irma became the worst hurricane to hit the Virgin Islands. Puerto Rico suffered major damage, but because Irma was 60 miles off the coast of the island, the damage was significantly less than the Lesser Antilles and Virgin Islands. Hurricane force winds battered the northern part of the island in the islands of Cuba and Vizcaya. In Cuba, the max wind gust of 100 miles per hour was detected, and a foot of rain fell across many areas in Puerto Rico proper. Due to the high winds, 1.1 million people lost power in the storm. Thankfully, the storm surge was minimal, but 3 people were killed due to Irma in Puerto Rico, and around $1 billion of damage occurred. Irma also weakened Puerto Rico's infrastructure and power lines, which would be disastrous if another major hurricane hit 2 weeks later. In Hispaniola, Irma caused tropical storm force winds for much of the island, and hurricane force winds were recorded in the northern parts of it as Irma was starting to undergo an eyewall replacement cycle that brought hurricane force winds deeper into the island as Irma expanded in size. The Dominican Republic suffered worse than Haiti, which had barely recovered from Hurricane Matthew 11 months prior. Infrastructure was damaged significantly, making it harder for help to arrive. 55,000 Dominican soldiers were deployed to assist in rescue and cleanup measures from the storm. Mudslides in Haiti damaged homes, crops, and infrastructure recently built in the aftermath of Matthew. 1 person was killed in Haiti, and an estimated $500 million of damage occurred in the Dominican Republic, with the damage being unknown in Haiti. The Turks and Caicos were hit hard from Irma, as the Eyewall impacted the main islands for over 2 hours. Infrastructure was absolutely destroyed in many areas, with some neighborhoods completely gone as a result of Irma. In some islands, up to 75% of the infrastructure was destroyed. In total, $500 million in damage occurred here, but miraculously, no one was killed. On the southernmost islands of the Bahamas, Irma had the most impact here out of the whole country, and as such, damage was limited but still extensive where it hit. Where Irma made landfall in Little Anguilla, extensive damage was recorded in the forests and jungle of the uninhabited island. However, Irma caused the least amount of devastation here due to the remoteness of the islands and the fact that Irma had weakened considerably. $135 million in damages occurred, and no one was killed. Probably the worst hit of all of the areas Irma impacted during the destructive life of it was Cuba. There is still debate on if Cuba, Florida, or if the Lesser Antilles got the worst of Irma, but it is undeniable that Cuba saw devastation and catastrophic damage from Irma, with most of the island, including the capital, Havana, being impacted. Irma made an unexpected and catastrophic landfall in Cuba at Category 5 strength, and it brought hell on earth to those it impacted. A max wind officially reported was 124 miles per hour, with a max gust at 159 miles per hour before the meter was knocked offline. In northern Cuba, the devastation was absolute from Irma's impact, with 158,000 homes being damaged and 15,000 completely destroyed, and storm surge swallowing entire resorts whole. A flamingo colony was affected, with sources ranging from the number killed from 500 to 5,000. In total, 10 people were killed by Irma in Cuba, a surprisingly low number due to the ferocity of the storm, but cost $13.2 billion in damages, making it the costliest hurricane in Cuban history, besting Hurricane Ike's record in 2008 by nearly double. The last place Irma would make landfall was Florida. Irma's impacts to the Florida Keys were total and absolute, with wind gusts up to 160 miles per hour impacting the island chain. 10 to 15 feet of storm surge was reported across both the Keys and the mainland. Infrastructure was heavily damaged in the Keys, even with water lines sustaining major damage. In total, $857 million in damage occurred in the Keys, which barely makes a dent to what would happen on the mainland. On the mainland, Irma was so large that it impacted the entire state of Florida to some degree. The Miami metropolitan area saw damage ranging from tree damage to homes losing roofs and walls. Agriculture was destroyed through much of Florida, with $2.6 billion in damage occurring in just agriculture alone. Storm surge occurred throughout the entire state, with some even as far north as North Carolina. Many homes, businesses, schools, and other buildings were destroyed due to Irma, and river flooding was commonplace. Especially in the Jacksonville area, flooding allowed some homes to fill up to 5 feet of water. In total, 94 people were killed in Florida, with 84 of them related to Irma and 10 directly as a result of the hurricane. In total, over $50 billion in damages occurred in the state, making it the costliest hurricane in Florida history and the costliest out of all of the areas impacted. There is one more thing that needs to be touched on before the documentary ends. Had Irma not made landfall in Cuba and stalled out as a result of this westward jog, it is likely that Irma's turn would have been much further to the west instead of the worst impacts at the Florida Keys and Naples. They would have turned to the Tampa area, and due to the size of the storm and the warm waters of the Gulf, it is possible that Irma would have been making landfall at Category 5 strength and causing catastrophic damage to the Tampa area. While this is speculation, it was a real possibility considering all it did. That landfall in Cuba likely saved a lot of lives in Florida, and while a Category 5 hurricane landfall anywhere is terrible, it may seem like somewhat of a saving grace that it did when it did. But that does not negate the fact that Irma caused catastrophic damage in Cuba, and no one should ever consider this a miracle, as it only did more harm to those in Cuba. Irma was the crown jewel of the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. Since then, there has not been one hurricane that has since made that track and that strong. However, we've had several hurricanes that have caused equally as catastrophic damage, including one that would hit Puerto Rico, where already being damaged by Irma, it would be completely destroyed by another hurricane. That hurricane, I'm sure all of you who are in Puerto Rico watching this, I'm sure you are very familiar with it. But that is a documentary for another time. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. It helps me out and helps me make more videos like these. The goal of this channel is to get more people engaged with weather. But with that being said, have a wonderful day. If you want to request a documentary, feel free to in the comments down below. But with that being said, stay safe.